764 hours, 11 days without a single second of sleep. Verified, documented, and the person who did it was 17 years old. He wasn't a soldier, he wasn't a scientist. He was a kid from San Diego who wanted to set a record. What happened to his mind during those 11 days reads like something written by someone who has never slept at all. Today we walk into the laboratories, the hospital rooms, and the long dark highways where American men and women discovered exactly how far the human brain can be pushed before it starts inventing its own reality. We'll meet the man whose eyes stayed open for so long that doctors weren't sure what to call what they were seeing. We'll stand inside the sleep deprivation chambers at Walter Reed Army Medical Center, where volunteers stared at fluorescent-lit walls until the walls started staring back. And finally, we'll look at the case that no sleep researcher anywhere in the world has ever fully explained. A man who didn't sleep for months, whose brain scans showed activity in regions that should have been dark, and who woke up one morning, picked up a newspaper, and read his own obituary. Ready? We're starting. 13. They called it the Army's White Room. In 1959, researchers at Walter Reed Army Medical Center in Washington, D.C., placed volunteer soldiers inside a windowless observation chamber with white walls, white floors, and white fluorescent lighting that never changed. There was no clock, no natural light, no sound but the ventilation hum. A single steel chair sat in the center, facing a blank wall. The experiment was designed to measure cognitive degradation under total sensory uniformity, not full sleep deprivation, but what made these cases extreme was the duration and what soldiers began to see around hour 70. By the end of the third day, multiple subjects reported the same thing, without being told what others had said. A figure standing in the corner. Not threatening, not moving, just present. One soldier insisted a colleague had entered the room and was standing against the far wall, watching him breathe. The room held only him. The fluorescent tubes buzzed on. Medical staff, observing through a one-way mirror, noted that subjects began turning their heads to maintain eye contact with nothing. Researchers logged the phenomenon as hypnagogic hallucination under sustained wakefulness, a known stage of sleep deprivation. But none of them could explain why the hallucination was always a human figure, always stationary, always in the corner. The chair is gone now. The building at Walter Reed still stands. And if you were to sit in a featureless white room long enough, the question isn't whether your brain would manufacture company. It's how long you'd take to realize it had. And that was only the starting point. The next case moved from the laboratory into the open desert. And what happened there can't be explained by controlled conditions at all. 12. It earned the name the Trucker's Blackout. And it happened not in a hospital, but on Interstate 80 in Nevada, somewhere between Winnemucca and Elko, a two-lane stretch of highway so flat that drivers have been known to fall asleep with their foot on the accelerator and travel a quarter-mile before the rumble strip wakes them. In 1993, a long-haul driver named Gary Heidnick completed a verified run of 91 continuous hours behind the wheel, carrying refrigerated freight from New Jersey to California. 91 hours, nearly 4 full days. He pulled into a truck stop outside Sacramento, walked to the restroom, and returned to find his cab. He did not recognize it. He stood in the parking lot for 11 minutes, confirmed by surveillance footage, moving from truck to truck, pressing his face against windows, convinced his own vehicle was stolen. A fellow driver found him and called a transport medic. When asked what he remembered of the final 12 hours of the drive, Gary said he remembered nothing. Not the road, not the turns, not the fuel stop outside Reno that showed up on his receipt. Medics who examined him described his eyes as tracking without processing, a documented condition called highway hypnosis, pushed to its neurological limit. His hands were still gripping an invisible steering wheel when they led him to a cot. The receipt from Reno sat in his shirt pocket. He had no memory of stopping. The truck had been driven by a body that had simply forgotten to stop. The highway eventually ends. The next case never really did. 11. Researchers in the field of fatal familial insomnia, the rarest and most absolute form of sleep loss, have documented fewer than 60 families worldwide carrying the gene. One of those families lives in the American Midwest, with cases recorded across 3 generations in Ohio, the most extensively studied American lineage in published medical literature. The condition is caused by a misfolded protein that progressively destroys the thalamus, the region of the brain that governs the gateway between wakefulness and sleep. What makes the Ohio cases uniquely documented is the precision of their medical records. The family permitted full neurological examination across generations, producing a dataset spanning decades. Patients in the Ohio line typically enter the first stage, mild insomnia, in their 50s. Within months, they move to hallucinations and panic attacks, then complete inability to sleep, then rapid cognitive and physical deterioration. One patient, whose full case is recorded in the Journal of Neuropathology and Experimental Neurology, remained conscious and largely verbal for 9 months after the onset of total sleeplessness. 9 months. He was examined by sleep specialists, neurologists, and a team from the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda, Maryland. And he could describe in precise language exactly what it felt like to need sleep and be physiologically incapable of achieving it. He described it as standing in front of a door you know how to open, reaching for the handle that isn't there, reaching again, every hour, forever. There is no treatment, there is no known survivor. The gene is dominant, which means every child of a carrier has a 50% chance of inheriting it. Somewhere in Ohio, there are people who do not yet know which side of that percentage they are on. This case involved a family. The next one involved a single man and a single number that no laboratory has ever matched. 10. His name was Randy Gardner, and the year was 1964. He was 17 years old, a student at Point Loma High School in San Diego, California, and he stayed awake for 264 hours and 24 minutes, 11 days and change, under supervised conditions that included Stanford sleep researcher William Dement and a United States Navy medical officer. This is the longest scientifically documented case of intentional sleep deprivation by a human being. The record has never been officially broken under supervised conditions. By day 4, Randy was unable to recognize objects by touch. By day 6, his speech had slowed to the pace of someone choosing each word from a list of thousands. By day 9, he could not complete a sentence that began with a subject he had introduced himself. On day 10, a fragment of a nursery rhyme appeared in his spoken output, mid-sentence, with no prompting. Researchers noted it and said nothing. He finished the challenge at a press conference in downtown San Diego. He answered questions clearly. He shook hands. He walked to his car. He slept for 14 hours and 57 minutes. When he woke up, he reported feeling fine. Follow-up studies later showed he experienced no long-term cognitive damage. His brain had apparently treated the 11 days as a debt it fully repaid. What researchers could not explain was how he maintained walking, speaking, and reasoning function past the point where every prior laboratory model predicted he would be unable to do so. The brain had no backup system that science had identified. It simply kept going. No one has tried to break his record under verified conditions since. Not officially, not safely. 10 records didn't beat Randy Gardner's, but the next case didn't try to. It tried to understand what happens when sleep loss isn't a choice. 9. They called it the nightmare death syndrome when it first appeared in American medical literature in the early 1980s, and the official name was sudden, unexplained nocturnal death syndrome. The cases concentrated in Southeast Asian refugee communities that had resettled in the United States, particularly in Fresno, California, and Minneapolis, Minnesota, and they involved young, healthy men dying in their sleep, with no identifiable cause. The connection to sleep deprivation came later, and it was not simple. Investigators at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, Georgia, began cataloging reports from community health workers of men who had stopped sleeping, not fully, but severely, weeks before their deaths. They were afraid. They reported vivid, recurring dreams of a crushing presence on their chest, a figure sitting on their sternum, pressing down. They avoided sleep to avoid the dream. The avoidance created a cycle of deprivation that compounded over weeks. By the time investigators understood the pattern, more than 100 deaths had been recorded across the country. The Fresno cases involved men whose sleep deprivation had reduced nighttime sleep to less than 2 hours over the final week of their lives. Autopsies showed no cardiac defect, no neurological abnormality, no toxicology finding. The death certificates read cardiac arrest. But the men had not slept, not truly, in days. Sleep researchers at Stanford University later proposed that prolonged deprivation, combined with elevated stress hormones, created a fatal cardiac arrhythmia window during the brief moments the men did lose consciousness. It remains a hypothesis. The crushing figure in the dream has been named in dozens of languages across dozens of cultures. It sits on the chest, it waits, and the only way to escape it was the one thing these men could not bring themselves to do. The next case moved from community to individual, and from nightmare to something closer to science. 8. Call it the stimulant cliff, because that is precisely what it was. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, a series of documented case reports from Veterans Administration hospitals across the country, including VA facilities in Houston, Texas, and Phoenix, Arizona, described veterans returning from military service who had used stimulants to sustain combat wakefulness and were now unable to stop. The stimulants are not named in this account because they do not need to be. What matters is the sleep architecture they destroyed. Sleep is not a simple on-off switch. It runs in 90-minute cycles through specific stages, including deep slow-wave sleep and the rapid eye movement stage where memory consolidation happens. The stimulants used in prolonged military operations interrupted this architecture so severely that veterans' brains had essentially forgotten how to initiate the sleep cycle. When the substances were removed, the brain did not revert. It stalled. VA physicians in Phoenix documented one veteran who lay in a hospital bed for 17 days, medically unassisted sleep attempted, registering almost no slow-wave activity whatsoever. He was clinically exhausted. His body showed every marker of profound fatigue. But the architecture that would allow restorative sleep was absent. It had been chemically erased. The ceiling tiles of the VA ward in Phoenix have been replaced since then. But if you were to lie in that room and stare upward long enough, you'd start to wonder what 17 days of staring at them does to a person who cannot close their eyes and mean it. What happened in Phoenix was chemistry. What happened next was something the laboratory was not built to explain. 7. There is a file at the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke in Bethesda, Maryland, that researchers in the sleep division refer to simply as the Rosario case. The patient's real name is protected. What is documented is this. In 1987, a woman in her early 40s from a New Mexico border community presented at a regional clinic after going without reported sleep for 22 days. Not reduced sleep, not fragmented sleep. Zero measured sleep activity on any monitoring equipment the clinic possessed. Her electroencephalogram showed waking brain patterns continuously. Her cortisol levels were those of a person who had been awake for 3 weeks. She was alert, she was conversational, she was terrified. She reported that she felt the need to sleep, but that each time she felt herself beginning to descend into it, something pulled her back. Not a sound, not a physical sensation, an internal, involuntary jolt, like a hiccup of consciousness. She compared it to trying to fall into a hole that kept moving. Researchers who reviewed her case proposed a dysfunction in the hypnic jerk mechanism, the brief muscle contraction that normally occurs as the body transitions from wakefulness to sleep, and that most people never notice. In her case, the mechanism was firing continuously, catching every descent and reversing it. She was never going to fall, because every time she approached the edge, her own nervous system caught her. After 28 days total, she finally slept. It took 13 minutes to initiate. She slept for 19 hours. When she woke up, she asked what year it was. She was told. She accepted the answer without apparent surprise. She has never publicly spoken about the experience. The file remains open at Bethesda. The theory about the hypnic jerk remains exactly that, a theory. 7 cases in, and the pattern is becoming clear. The brain does not give up easily. But the next case shows what happens when it is pushed past easy. 6. The Marines call sleeplessness a force multiplier when it is controlled, and a force destructor when it is not. In 2003, following combat operations in Iraq, researchers embedded with medical units documented a cluster of cases from a Marine battalion that had sustained operations for over 90 hours continuously, the longest verified sustained combat wakefulness period recorded by United States military medical staff in that conflict. By hour 70, field medics were noting in their logs a phenomenon they described informally as the walking sleep. Marines who were physically mobile, issuing commands, and responding to stimuli were also, by every other clinical indicator, asleep. Their eyes were open, their hands were on their rifles. They were responding to their names, but when asked to describe their surroundings, they described places that were not there. One sergeant described in detail a building on the left side of the road. The road was open desert. A corporal reported receiving orders from an officer who had not been present for 18 hours. The phenomenon, later documented in a paper published by the Naval Health Research Center in San Diego, was described as micro-sleep cascades compounded by dissociation, the brain entering sleep in rolling fragments, while the motor system continued executing trained patterns. The Marines could walk because they had walked 1,000 times before. Their bodies remembered. Their brains were somewhere else entirely. Standing on that road in the Iraqi desert, surrounded by men whose eyes were open and whose minds were somewhere private, the medics logged their observations in the fluorescent light of a field tent and tried not to think too hard about who was actually on watch. The military pushed the limits deliberately. The next case found them by accident. 5. On the shore of Lake Michigan in Illinois, there is a research record from the University of Chicago's sleep laboratory that dates to 1968 and involves one of the most precisely measured voluntary sleep deprivation experiments conducted outside of a military setting. The researcher is identified in published papers only as Subject M. He was a doctoral candidate in the psychology department. He volunteered to remain awake for as long as possible under full clinical observation, with electrodes monitoring every electrical impulse in his brain, every breath, every heartbeat. He made it to 173 hours, a little over 7 days, which would not make this list except for what the recordings showed during hours 140 through 173. The EEG data recorded during those final 33 hours showed something that had not been documented before. The brain was entering sleep states of between 2 and 15 seconds, hundreds of times per hour, with the subject's eyes open and his body in an upright seated position. He was awake and asleep simultaneously, cycling between states so rapidly that the monitoring equipment logged the transitions as noise before researchers realized what they were seeing. During one 15-second sleep burst, Subject M picked up a pencil from the desk in front of him, placed it behind his ear, and continued the conversation he had been having, as if nothing had occurred. He had no memory of the pencil. It was still behind his ear when he finally surrendered to sleep 9 minutes later. The pencil is not mentioned in any published paper. It was logged in the observational notes kept by a graduate student who was in the room. Those notes are in the University of Chicago archive. The pencil, presumably, is not. 5 entries in, and every case has had a witness. The next one had the whole country watching. 4. Peter Tripp was a radio disc jockey in New York City, and in January of 1959, he broadcast his radio program from a glass booth in Times Square for 201 hours, 8 days and 9 hours, as a charity event for the March of Dimes. He did it in public. Thousands of people walked past the booth on Broadway. His voice went out on WMGM radio across the metropolitan area every day. By day 3, he was answering listener phone calls while sitting in a pool of water he could not identify as his own because he had forgotten he was wearing shoes. By day 4, he told his producers that a doctor who had entered the booth to examine him was an undertaker who had come to bury him alive. He was completely certain. The doctor was his physician of 12 years. By day 5, Tripp stood on the floor of the booth and looked down at his shoes and saw flames rising from the floorboards. He did not scream. He stepped calmly to one side and continued his broadcast. By day 8, he had to be physically guided to the microphone because he could no longer navigate the booth by memory. When he finally slept, in a hotel room off Times Square, he slept for 13 hours. He woke up and told a reporter that something had changed. He could not specify what. His marriage ended within the year. His professional reputation never fully recovered. Psychologists who studied him afterward proposed that the extreme public exposure, combined with sleep deprivation, had created a permanent alteration in how he processed his own identity. Not brain damage, something subtler. The sense of who he was, which had dissolved across those 201 hours in a glass booth on Broadway, had not entirely reconstituted itself when sleep finally came. The booth is long gone. Times Square rebuilt itself around its absence. But somewhere in the WMGM audio archive, if the tapes survived, his voice is still broadcasting from inside it. 3 entries left. The air changes here. 3. In the archives of the Stanford Center for Sleep Sciences and Medicine in Palo Alto, California, there is a case from 1978 that sleep researchers call the the baseline paradox. A man identified in all published materials as David F. entered the clinic reporting that he had not experienced what he described as real sleep in 4 years. Not 4 days, not 4 weeks, 4 years. He could close his eyes. He could achieve what he called a resting state. But he woke from it with no sense of having been unconscious, no gap, no transition. He described waking from sleep as simply being in a different position than he had been in before his eyes closed. Like changing slides on a projector. There was no darkness. There was no before. Stanford researchers ran overnight polysomnography on David F. for 7 consecutive nights. The recordings showed sleep architecture that looked, to the instruments, more or less normal. Slow-wave sleep was present. Rapid eye movement periods were recorded. By every measurable indicator, David F. was sleeping, but David F. insisted he was not. He sat in the monitoring room and described his experience in real time, while electrodes confirmed that 3 minutes prior he had been in stage 2 sleep. He had no subjective experience of it whatsoever. Researchers proposed a condition they called sleep state misperception, a documented phenomenon where the brain genuinely fails to encode the experience of sleep into conscious memory. But David F.'s case was more extreme than prior documented instances. He had lived, by his own account, in an unbroken 4-year waking. Every morning for 4 years had been continuous with every evening before it. He had watched his children grow without a single subjective night between one day and the next. He described it not as insomnia, but as the removal of something he could not name, a texture of life that had simply disappeared one evening in 1974 and had not returned. When the Stanford team published their findings, they listed him as a case of paradoxical insomnia, severe. In their private notes, 2 researchers used a different term, awake without interruption. He was discharged with a treatment plan. There is no follow-up record. Whether David F. ever found his way back to darkness is not documented anywhere that is publicly accessible. The lights in the monitoring room at Stanford are still on. The next case holds the American record for the longest verified extreme sleep disruption outside of fatal familial insomnia. It is not a comfortable record to hold. 2. In 2012, a 44-year-old man from Houston, Texas, identified in medical literature as patient EC, was admitted to the sleep disorders unit at the University of Texas Health Science Center after his wife documented, in a handwritten log she had kept for 11 months, that her husband had not slept for more than 20 minutes at a stretch since the previous January. 11 months of entries, every night, timestamps, behavioral observations. She had filled 4 spiral-bound notebooks. Physicians initially suspected severe obstructive sleep apnea, a condition where the airway collapses during sleep and wakes the patient before restorative sleep is achieved. They were right, and they were also only partly right. EC had apnea, but he also had a neural feedback loop that had formed over those 11 months, where his brain had learned to anticipate the apnea event and wake itself before it could be triggered. He was no longer waking because his airway closed. He was waking because his brain had decided, somewhere in 11 months of conditioning, that sleep itself was the threat. He had developed a learned biological fear of his own unconsciousness. Treatment with continuous positive airway pressure machinery removed the physical cause, but the neural pattern persisted for another 4 months. He would put on the mask, his airways would remain open, his body would breathe without interruption, and his brain would wake him anyway, 20 minutes in, scanning for a danger that was no longer present. Physicians at the University of Texas described this as one of the most extensive documented cases of conditioned arousal disorder ever recorded in American clinical literature. The notebooks his wife kept are referenced in the published case study. She filled 4 of them. When asked how she had maintained the log through 11 months of what must have been an extraordinarily difficult household, she told researchers she was afraid that if she stopped writing it down, no one would believe them. The 4 notebooks are now part of the case file. The spiral binding on the first one was completely worn through by the time she handed it over. 1 case remains, and it is the one that sleep researchers return to when they want to remind themselves how little they actually understand. 1. His name was Al Herpin, and he lived alone in a small house outside Trenton, New Jersey, in the early 20th century. And according to every documented account assembled by physicians, journalists, and neurological researchers who examined him between 1904 and his death in 1947, Al Herpin never slept. Not once. Not for a single measurable moment in at least the 90 years of life he was known to have lived. He had no bed. Investigators who visited his home found a rocking chair beside the window where he passed the dark hours. A chair worn smooth at the armrests, in a way consistent with decades of continuous use. The floorboards in front of it were darker than those to the sides. He had been in that chair, in that spot, for years. Physicians from the New Jersey State Medical Society examined him repeatedly. They sent specialists. They sent skeptics. They sent researchers who arrived convinced he was fabricating the claim, and left without a satisfactory explanation for how fabrication was possible. Continuous monitoring over extended periods showed no sleep state, no closing of the eyes, no measurable slowing of brain activity into any recognized sleep pattern. He read. He worked in his garden. He answered letters. At night, he sat in the chair. He reported no tiredness, no hallucinations, no cognitive impairment of any kind that observers could detect. He lived to the age of approximately 94. His mind, by all accounts, is clear until near the end. Sleep researchers who have reviewed his case uniformly identify it as the most extreme documented anomaly in American sleep medicine history. They also uniformly note that they cannot explain it. The rocking chair was still in the house when he died. The window it faced looked out on a garden he had tended without ever once requiring the restoration that every other known human body requires to survive. There is a theory, advanced quietly in certain neurological circles, that a structural abnormality in Herpin's thalamus from birth had simply routed his brain's restorative functions into waking operation rather than sleep. That what other humans accomplish in 8 hours of darkness, Herpin's brain accomplished continuously, invisibly, in the background of every waking hour. It is a theory. It is the only one that begins to approach an explanation. His garden is gone. His house has been replaced. But the rocking chair, if it survives somewhere in a New Jersey archive or attic, still holds the shape of a man who sat through every night the rest of us have spent unconscious, watching the dark garden through glass, fully and inexplicably awake. The brain is not a machine. It does not follow the rules you post on it. It has a locked room inside it where the rules do not reach. And these 13 cases are 13 attempts to find the door. Not by science, not always. Sometimes by accident. Sometimes by stubbornness. Sometimes by a kind of suffering that has no good name. What these cases share is not the absence of sleep. It is the presence of something stubborn in the human nervous system that refuses to concede without a fight. Randy Gardner went 11 days and walked out fine. David F. lived 4 years in unbroken waking and still recognized his children's faces. Al Herpin sat in his chair for 90 years and tended his garden every morning. The brain, it turns out, is a negotiator. Push it far enough and it finds solutions you didn't design and didn't ask for and can't entirely explain. The question for you then, which of these 13 cases do you think is the one that finally changes how we understand sleep? The 17-year-old who proved the limit can be survived, or the old man in New Jersey who proved there might not be a limit at all? Like this if you stayed awake to the end. Stay safe, and see you soon.